The sun had only begun its slow rise over Houston International Airport, casting long golden streaks across the polished terminal floor. The hum of early flights stirred the building like a quiet symphony, suitcases rolling, announcements echoing overhead, and travelers speaking in hushed urgency. It was the morning when everything moved with purpose, yet felt suspended in a kind of silence. Among the flood of morning passengers, two figures stood apart, not because they were loud or dressed extravagantly, but because they were still, and present. Elijah Moore, 17 years old, stood with calm authority near Gate A12. He wore a clean navy sweater, charcoal slacks, and crisp white sneakers. He carried himself with the quiet poise of someone raised to think carefully before speaking. Beside him stood his younger sister, Jasmine, just 14, gently holding a small box wrapped in gold paper and tied with a satin ribbon. It was their grandmother's birthday, and this trip, though only 2 hours long, meant everything to both of them. It wasn't just a visit, it was a surprise, a moment of love boxed in gold. Jasmine glanced around nervously, her fingers grazing the ribbon as if to keep her heart steady. Elijah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We're fine," he said softly. "We're just flying. Nothing more." The gate agent called their group first class, and Elijah led the way, their boarding passes already scanned, their presence barely noticed. They didn't expect fanfare. They didn't ask for anything more than what they paid for: a seat, a journey, and a moment of peace. They stepped onto the jet bridge, then into the cabin, where the first-class section glowed with soft lighting and quiet. Leather seats, warm-toned accents, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee offered a fleeting comfort. A businessman folded his newspaper. A woman adjusted her scarf. No one looked twice as Elijah and Jasmine made their way to row 2. They placed their carry-ons gently in the overhead bin, Jasmine carefully sliding the gift box under the seat in front of her. She sat upright, her eyes bright with anticipation, her shoulders drawn in just slightly. Elijah settled beside her, glancing out the window. The tarmac stretched wide and clean under the morning sun. Everything felt normal. Everything was as it should be, until it wasn't. A voice, clear, clipped, and cold, cut across the calm. "Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right seats?" Elijah turned his head. A tall woman in uniform stood over them. Her name tag read Rachel Stevens, Senior Cabin Supervisor. Her blonde hair was tightly pinned back, her posture firm. But it was her eyes, flat and scanning, that delivered the true tone. "These are first-class seats," she added, as though they hadn't heard her the first time. Elijah remained composed. "Yes, ma'am. We're in 2A and 2B. Rachel didn't acknowledge his words. She merely held out her hand. "Boarding passes, please." He handed them over. She stared at them longer than necessary. Her eyes flicked from the passes to their faces and back again. Everything matched. But the tension remained. She gave them back without a smile. "Just checking," she said coolly, then walked away without another word. Jasmine didn't say anything, but her hands had moved slightly, fingertips now gripping the gold box a little tighter. Elijah leaned back, eyes forward. He didn't need to explain. They both knew what that moment was. They had done nothing wrong, but they had been seen as wrong. It would have been easy to pretend it didn't matter, to sink into their seats and brush off the encounter like lint from a jacket. But that moment had left something behind, a weight, small but present, like the chill that lingers after someone slams a door. Passengers continued to board, the cabin slowly filled with quiet conversation and the rustle of belongings. A soft chime sounded as the engines began their early rumble. Elijah closed his eyes briefly. Jasmine exhaled, letting her hands rest again on her lap. And then just before the aircraft door closed, Rachel returned. But this time, there was no politeness, no inquiry, no pretense. "I'm going to need you both to move to the back," she said, standing firm, voice louder than it needed to be. Elijah blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Those seats are now needed for other passengers," Rachel said flatly. "Please come with me." "No explanation?" he asked. "There's been a change," she replied. "I don't need to explain further." Jasmine's voice was barely above a whisper. "We didn't do anything." Elijah nodded to her, then turned back to Rachel. His voice was calm, unwavering. "We're not moving. Call the captain." For a second, time stopped. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Her jaw tensed. Then her voice rose, drawing attention from passengers across the cabin. "If you don't move, I'll call security." The hum of conversation shifted. Passengers turned their heads. A few whispers rose. Someone pulled out a phone. Jasmine reached down and quietly unlocked hers. Her fingers moved fast. One message. One contact. Elijah didn't look. He didn't need to. He knew what she was doing, and he knew what would come next. Rachel spun on her heel and stormed down the aisle, each step echoing like a drumbeat of mistake. She didn't know. Not yet. Not who they were, not what they'd done, and not how close she now stood to the end of her career. Rachel Stevens marched down the aisle with tight, clipped steps. The back of her neck burned, though she wouldn't admit it. She told herself she was just doing her job. She told herself this wasn't personal, but deep down, something in her had already started unraveling. As she reached the front galley, she grabbed the intercom phone and pressed the button for the cockpit. "Captain Miles," she said, her voice stiff. "We have a situation in first class. 2 passengers are refusing to move. I need security on standby." There was a pause, brief but loaded. Then a voice answered. But it wasn't the captain. It was deeper, calmer, sharper. "This is Nathaniel Moore. Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Rachel froze. A sudden, unnatural stillness settled over her body. Her eyes darted down to the phone like it had betrayed her. Her breath hitched. That name. That name. She turned her head slightly, eyes scanning the cabin, looking for confirmation she hadn't just imagined it. And there in row 2, Elijah was watching her. So was Jasmine. And suddenly, nothing about this was routine anymore. Rachel's mind scrambled. More? Could it be? No, it can't. That's a coincidence. It has to be. But the voice spoke again. This time, not asking, demanding. "You just attempted to remove my niece and nephew from their assigned seats. Do you have an explanation?" Silence spread across the cabin like a storm cloud swallowing light. The once charming hum of idle chatter was gone. Passengers were still, tense, watching. A businessman behind row 3 leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "Did he say Nathaniel Moore, the CEO?" A woman 2 rows up turned slightly, her lips parted in disbelief. Rachel's throat closed. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Her hands, so steady when pointing fingers, now trembled at her sides. Back in row 2, Jasmine leaned slightly into Elijah, her voice a whisper. "Did he mean to do that?" Elijah nodded, his voice as steady as ever. "He never says anything by accident." Jasmine exhaled slowly, still holding the gold gift box on her lap. She hadn't moved an inch since Rachel's demand. Neither had Elijah. They hadn't needed to. And yet everything around them had begun to shift. Passengers weren't looking at them like a mistake anymore. They were looking at them like a message. At the front of the cabin, the cockpit door opened. Captain Gregory Miles stepped out. He was tall, composed, with silver streaks brushing the sides of his neatly combed hair. His presence immediately quieted the entire front cabin. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He walked up beside Rachel, whose back stiffened like a soldier caught out of line. "You said there was a seating issue," he said, voice low and sharp. "You didn't mention it involved the Moore family." Rachel's lips parted, but no words emerged. Her eyes, once sharp and judgmental, now searched the room for an escape she knew didn't exist. The captain didn't wait for an answer. He turned to Elijah and Jasmine. "I apologize deeply for the disturbance," he said, his tone respectful even. "Are you both all right?" Elijah gave a simple nod. "We're fine. Thank you, Captain." Captain Miles nodded once more. Then he turned back to Rachel, his voice shifting to steel. "Miss Stevens, please return to the galley. I'll speak with you in private momentarily." Rachel hesitated, just for a moment, but the expression in his eyes left no room for debate. "Ground operations have been contacted. The crew member responsible for the incident is to be removed from active duty immediately." Gas swept across the cabin. A passenger 3 rows back started recording, angling their phones subtly over the top of the seat. No one told them to stop. No one moved. The moment had taken hold of everyone. Jasmine gripped the box a little tighter, but this time, not out of fear. Elijah sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. Rachel, standing in the galley, heard every word. And for the first time in her career, she didn't feel like the one with control. She felt like the one who had been seen, truly seen, and found wanting. A soft chime sounded. The captain's voice returned. "Cabin crew, prepare for a temporary delay. Ground control is holding us." But there was no confusion about the delay's cause. Everyone knew. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't technical. It was Rachel. And it was the two young passengers who refused to move. Not with force, not with outrage, but with presence. With 5 simple words. "We're not moving. Call the captain." The plane hadn't moved an inch. Outside the window, the morning sun continued to rise, casting soft streaks of amber light across the tarmac. But inside the cabin, time felt strangely frozen. Conversations had stopped. Coffee cups sat untouched. The usual rhythm of pre-takeoff chatter had collapsed under something heavier, something unspoken. Elijah and Jasmine Moore sat quietly in row 2, their posture straight, their expressions unreadable. But the entire cabin was watching them now, watching with a different kind of gaze. Earlier, they had been viewed with doubt. Now they were viewed with wonder. And just beneath that wonder, a faint thread of guilt. From the galley at the back of the aircraft, Rachel Stevens stood motionless, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her badge still clung to her blouse, but it didn't feel like authority anymore. It felt like a costume, like a name tag for a character she didn't recognize. Every breath she took felt louder than it should have. Every footstep from the passing crew echoed with judgment. Every glance she received, subtle, fleeting, and sharp, reminded her that she no longer belonged. Up front, a young flight attendant named Claire Nguyen quietly approached row 2. She walked slowly, respectfully, her hands folded in front of her, her shoulders slightly drawn in. She paused beside Elijah and Jasmine's seats. "Can I get you anything before we continue?" she asked gently. Her voice was soft, not the usual scripted warmth, but something more human, something closer to an apology. Jasmine looked up, hesitated, then shook her head politely. Elijah remained silent. Claire nodded, understanding more in their silence than words could ever offer. She turned away, disappearing behind the galley curtain. And just like that, the power dynamic on the plane had shifted again. In the cockpit, Captain Gregory Miles sat with his headset still on. Across from him on the screen was Marilyn DeWitt, the airline's regional operations manager. Her expression was tight, focused. She wasn't watching a flight manifest. She was watching the beginning of a PR storm. "She filed the incident into the internal log," Captain Miles said, his tone clipped. "But we've got audio, intercom, passenger video. It's already leaking." Marilyn nodded grimly. "Mr. Moore has already escalated the report. The legal team is reviewing it. HR flagged her file. She's not flying again." Captain Miles didn't flinch. "I figured." "What about the kid?" Miss Marilyn asked. "Are they all right?" He looked toward the cockpit door. "Better than most adults would be." Back in row 2, Jasmine finally spoke again, so softly only Elijah could hear. "I didn't think it would go this far." Elijah turned to her. His eyes were calm but focused. It had to. She stared down at her hands resting on the gift box, the one they had wrapped so carefully the night before, with matching gold ribbon and a handwritten card. "It was supposed to be a good day," she whispered. "It still can be," Elijah said quietly, "but not for everyone." The intercom crackled once more. This time the voice wasn't Nathaniel Moore's or the captain's. It was Claire's. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began carefully, "as we prepare for a delay, we thank you for your patience. Please remain seated. Crew will be making rounds if you need anything." It was the kind of announcement meant to sound routine, but everyone knew it wasn't. Every passenger understood they weren't waiting for airspace. They were waiting for justice. A few rows back, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair leaned across the aisle. Her face was gentle, her eyes kind. She looked toward Jasmine. "You two handled that with grace," she said softly. "More than many adults would have." Jasmine blinked, then nodded. "Thank you." The woman gave a small smile. "And don't let her ruin flying for you. I've flown for years. It's not supposed to feel like this." Elijah gave a polite nod. It doesn't always, but sometimes people forget who's really on board. Meanwhile, at the terminal gate, a quiet crowd had begun to gather. Not passengers, executives, sharp suits, clipboard carriers, PR managers holding phones to their ears. And at the center of them all, standing with a stillness that carried weight, was Nathaniel Moore. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't shouting. He was waiting. Waiting to ensure that this time, the consequence wasn't just internal. Inside the aircraft, Rachel sat alone in the rear jump seat. Her palms were sweating. Her uniform, once neatly pressed, now felt suffocating. She thought back to the moment, just 20 minutes earlier, when she had approached the two teens with cold confidence. She thought she was doing her job, maintaining order, keeping control. But what she had done was act out of assumption. She hadn't checked the policy. She hadn't followed procedure. She had followed her instinct. And that instinct had led her straight into a reckoning. The intercom rang again. This time, a direct crew call. Claire answered, then turned to Rachel. "The captain wants to see you." Rachel stood slowly, her legs heavy beneath her. As she made her way forward, the cabin's silence became deafening. She passed passengers who just hours ago might have smiled at her, asked for a drink, and thanked her for service. Now they looked away. Or worse, they looked straight at her. She passed row 2. Jasmine glanced up but said nothing. That silence, sharp, deliberate cut deeper than any accusation. Rachel entered the cockpit, where Captain Miles sat with his arms crossed. On the screen beside him, Marilyn DeWitt's face remained stern. Rachel tried to speak, but Captain Miles raised a hand. "No statements," he said. "You're being removed from active duty." Rachel's breath caught. "I didn't know who they were." "That's the problem," Marilyn interrupted. "You didn't need to know. Their boarding passes were valid. Their presence wasn't the issue. Your judgment was." Rachel's shoulders dropped. She had no more ground to stand on. Marilyn continued, "Effective immediately, your access is revoked. Your badge will be surrendered before we land. You'll be escorted off the aircraft." Rachel didn't argue. She couldn't, because deep down she knew she hadn't just lost her job. She had lost the trust that the job required. Back in the cabin, Claire stepped forward once more and placed 2 bottles of water gently on Elijah and Jasmine's tray table. "Please let me know if you need anything," she said softly. Elijah nodded. Jasmine didn't respond, but she looked up just long enough for Claire to understand. Respect had shifted, not through volume, but through stillness. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, not because of turbulence or nightfall, but because the weight of what had transpired was settling in like fog, quiet, creeping, and inescapable. Passengers remained in their seats, their movements minimal, their eyes shifting between one another. No one spoke louder than a whisper. It was as if the entire plane had collectively agreed. This is not just a delay. This was something different. In the rear jump seat, Rachel Stevens sat like a statue carved from regret. Her spine was stiff against the cold panel wall behind her, and her fingers trembled beneath the fabric of her uniform skirt. Her name tag, Rachel Stevens, Senior Cabin Supervisor, gleamed faintly in the overhead light, but it didn't feel like a badge of honor anymore. It felt like evidence. She kept replaying the moment, the look in Elijah's eyes when he calmly said, "We're not moving. Call the captain." He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't even pleaded. And somehow that had undone her more than a confrontation ever could have. From the front, Claire Nguyen returned, this time not with a tray or bottled water, but with a printed document in hand, folded in thirds and trembling slightly in her fingers. She approached Rachel slowly. "This just came through," she said quietly. Rachel took it with a shaking hand, unfolding it as if peeling back her undoing. It was a formal notice of suspension pending termination review, issued by corporate operations and countersigned by Nathaniel Moore himself. Her eyes stopped on the first line. "Effective immediately, Miss Rachel Stevens is to be removed from in-flight duty. Her badge and security access are to be surrendered before landing. Upon arrival, she will be escorted to administration for final review." Rachel's mouth went dry. She looked up. "Before we even land?" Claire nodded solemnly. They don't want you stepping off the aircraft in uniform." Rachel didn't reply. She just sat. The humiliation dug deeper than she'd expected. Not because she didn't see it coming, but because it was public. This wasn't a closed-door meeting. This was a mid-air reckoning. Up front, Elijah remained still. Jasmine, still holding the gold-wrapped gift box on her lap, glanced sideways at her brother. "Do you think she's getting removed?" she asked, barely audible. Elijah nodded slightly. "Uncle Nathaniel doesn't call the cockpit just to scare people." She exhaled, long and slow, her breath fogging the side of the window beside her. I wanted to fly," she whispered. "I was excited. I've never been in first class before." "I know," Elijah said gently, "and you didn't do anything wrong." Across the aisle, a middle-aged man leaned toward them. His voice was soft but steady. "I just wanted to say," he said to Elijah, "I saw everything. You both handled it better than most adults I know." Elijah nodded. "Thank you." The man shook his head. "People like her think they can treat anyone however they want. I'm glad someone finally said no." Back in the galley, Rachel buried her face in her hands for a brief moment, her breath sharp and shallow. She had always carried herself with a sense of control, built not just on rank, but on presence. But now she wasn't in control. She wasn't even present in the way she used to be. She was an absence waiting to happen. A vacancy has already been written into the system. Her uniform felt heavier now, like each thread was stitched with the weight of judgment. A soft knock tapped against the galley wall. Claire returned, this time not alone, but with a quiet pause in her expression. "Security will be meeting us at the gate," she said. "They're already in position." Rachel blinked. "Are they going to do this in front of passengers?" Claire looked at her for a long moment, then replied with all the gentleness she could summon. "They already are." At gate A12, Nathaniel Moore stood like a monument. He didn't pace. He didn't check his phone. His hands were clasped neatly in front of him. The executives around him barely spoke. They didn't need to, because this wasn't a meeting, it was a message. Inside the cabin, Captain Miles's voice came back on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and return tray tables to their upright position." The robotic voice that followed delivered the standard safety reminders, but no one heard them as routine, because nothing about this flight was routine anymore. Rachel sat upright, her badge now clipped in her trembling hand. Her mind spun with impossible fantasies. Maybe I could explain myself. Maybe I could issue a statement. Maybe they'll let me resign quietly. But none of that would happen, because she hadn't just failed to follow procedure. She had exposed something deeper, something that didn't come from training or corporate culture, something that came from within. And the silence that followed her decisions, that deafening, wordless backlash, spoke louder than anything she could say now. As the wheels touched down and the cabin lurched slightly forward, Rachel looked up and saw passengers craning their necks, not toward the exit, but toward her. Some openly stared. Some stole glances. All of them knew. And the worst part, so did she. Row by row, passengers began standing, reaching for bags, straightening jackets. But there was no laughter, no lightness, no airport chatter. Instead, there was stillness, a collective acknowledgement that something had shifted, a tension that hadn't lifted, but settled, like dust in sunlight. At the front, Claire stepped toward Elijah and Jasmine. "Mr. Moore has requested to speak with you both privately after the flight," she said softly. "If you don't mind waiting until we finish deplaning." Jasmine nodded. Elijah said simply, "Of course." In the rear, Rachel stood. Her knees buckled slightly from the hours of tension, but she caught herself. She reached for her small duffel, unzipped it, and tucked her badge inside. Claire, who had returned to help, watched silently. Rachel looked at her. "Are they really doing this publicly?" she whispered again. Claire's answer came in the softest tone possible. "They have to." Rachel said nothing, because she understood. She walked forward slowly. Every step stretched. Each aisle felt longer than the last. She passed passengers who turned to look, some with curiosity, some with quiet fury. Others simply watched without emotion, but with full understanding. When she reached row 2, she paused. She glanced at Jasmine for half a second. Jasmine looked up. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. That silence, powerful, deliberate, and absolute, hit Rachel like a cold wave. And that, more than the termination notice or the uniform removal, is what burned into her memory. The jet bridge stood connected, motionless and waiting, an open throat of steel and silence. But no one rushed to leave. The cabin remained eerily still. Row after row of passengers stood with their bags in hand, but no one moved toward the exit. It wasn't confusion that kept them there. It was awareness, curiosity, respect, and something else. They were waiting to see what would happen next. From her place near the back galley, Rachel Stevens stood upright but hollow. Her back ached from tension, her legs stiff from holding composure that had long since cracked beneath the surface. The badge was gone. The uniform still on her body no longer felt like hers. Each breath scraped her lungs like paper. The engine hummed, once familiar, now roared in her ears like a countdown. And ahead at the mouth of the aircraft stood her judgment. Richard Nathaniel Moore, tall and composed in a charcoal gray suit, waited just outside the aircraft door. He stood perfectly still, hands loosely clasped before him. He didn't shift weight. He didn't glance at his phone. He didn't need to. To his left stood 2 security officers. To his right, a senior operations director is holding a tablet. Behind them, a small gathering of airport executives, HR representatives, and a PR consultant with a visibly clenched jaw. They weren't here for routine. They were here to watch her leave. Rachel gripped the duffel bag with both hands. Her steps forward were slow, deliberate, each one echoing like a verdict. The aisle had never felt so long. As she passed the rows, whispers tickled her ears. Not mocking, not jeering, just present, real. You see her? That's her. She's the one. Phones weren't raised. No one wanted to break the invisible glass of this moment, but expressions were etched with memory. No one on that plane would forget this. She reached row 2, and then she looked at Jasmine. The girl was still sitting, still calm, still silent. She wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't trembling. She was just there, looking up, watching Rachel. Her hand still rested on the golden box in her lap, unopened, but still pristine. A symbol of everything this flight was supposed to be. A gift, a journey, a celebration. Rachel hesitated. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come, because no apology could erase the echo of her earlier command. Move to the back. And no defense could justify why she said it, only who she said it to. She looked away and walked on. At the aircraft door, Richard Moore stepped forward. "Miss Stevens," he said calmly. His voice was cool but formal, lethal in its restraint. Rachel swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't—" He lifted a hand, silencing her. "No statements," he said, his tone even. "No excuses." She stopped. Her eyes flicked to the officers standing nearby, then back to him. For a second, she looked smaller than her frame, younger than her years, but no less accountable. Richard turned to the officers. "Escort her to administration. Her badge has been revoked. Her uniform will be returned after documentation is complete." Rachel opened her mouth again, but nothing came. One of the officers gestured for her to exit, and just like that, she was walked off the aircraft. Not as crew, not even as a passenger, but as someone who had crossed a line too many saw for too long and did nothing about it, until now. As she disappeared into the terminal, the cabin didn't cheer, didn't clap, because this wasn't a victory. It was balanced, restored. Back inside the cabin, a soft breath of air passed through the rows as though the tension had finally started to lift. A passenger muttered, "Finally." Another whispered, "Took long enough." But most just stood quietly, watching the door she had just stepped through, as if something sacred had left the aircraft with her. Near the rear, Claire Nguyen stood with her hands behind her back, head bowed slightly. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't relieved. She was reflecting on how easy it was for power to corrupt tone, how one glance could undo dignity, and how two teenagers had managed to reclaim it, not with anger, but with presence. At the front, Elijah and Jasmine remained seated, as requested. Claire approached them again. "You're free to exit now," she said gently, "but Mr. Moore asked if you would wait just a moment longer. He'd like to speak with you privately." Jasmine blinked. "Is it about her?" Claire nodded. "About everything." They said nothing, but agreed. Meanwhile, Rachel stood in a sterile, glass-walled conference room within the airport's administrative wing. Her personal belongings sat in a clear plastic bag beside her chair. Her badge, shredded, her login, disabled. Her name, already been removed from the flight roster. She stared at the blank wall ahead. No clock, no screen, no dignity left. A staff member entered. "Sign here," he said, setting a clipboard down. "Acknowledgement of termination and surrender of all company property." Rachel stared at the line. "I gave 13 years, she murmured. He didn't respond. She signed. Back at the gate, Richard Moore turned toward the cabin as the last few passengers exited. Some nodded respectfully toward him. Others kept their heads down. But every single one of them knew they'd witnessed something that mattered. That needed to happen. That should have happened long ago. Inside the aircraft, Claire approached Elijah and Jasmine one last time. "Mr. Moore is ready for you now." Jasmine stood first, gold box still in hand. Elijah followed, calm and steady. As they stepped into the aisle, something strange happened. Passengers still lingering, parted. Not because they were famous, but because they were right. Outside the aircraft door, Richard gave them a small nod. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir." Richard exhaled slowly, just once. "Let's talk away from the crowd." The automatic doors at Terminal A whispered open as Elijah and Jasmine Moore stepped into the private executive lounge, flanked quietly by two airline staffers. Inside, the space was silent but plush. Muted lighting, soft gray carpets, a tray of untouched bottled water on a polished glass table. The windows overlooked the tarmac, but the outside world felt far away. And yet, it wasn't. Because even now, out beyond the lounge walls, the world had already begun to shift. Nathaniel Moore stood near the center of the room. His tie was loose now, though his posture remained impeccable. The steel in his eyes had softened, but not completely. When he saw them, he took a quiet step forward. "You both did everything right," he said. "You could have shouted, escalated, but instead, you reminded everyone how powerful quiet dignity can be." Jasmine looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the golden ribbon still tied around the gift box. "I didn't want her to lose everything," she said quietly. Nathaniel tilted his head. "She didn't lose everything because of you, Jasmine. She lost it because of her choices. All we did was hold up a mirror." In another wing of the terminal, Rachel Stevens sat inside a plain, white-walled room used for employee separation procedures. Her phone sat face down on the table, its screen black, buzzing occasionally with unread messages, none of which she could bring herself to open. Her contract was canceled. Her access to internal systems had been revoked. And with one more signature, her career in aviation would be over. But what stung the most wasn't the termination paperwork. It was the silence. Not the silence around her, but the one within her. That aching, cavernous absence where her pride had once lived. Back in the executive lounge, Nathaniel poured a glass of water, then set it down untouched. "I've already spoken with the board," he said. "The company is releasing a statement, a real one. No vague language, no "we're aware of the situation" nonsense." He looked at Elijah. "It will name no passengers, but it will make something very clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was misconduct." Elijah nodded slowly. "And if she goes somewhere else?" "She won't," Nathaniel replied. "At least not easily. Her record is flagged across the industry. Anyone who checks will see the report." He paused, then added, "But the bigger question isn't what happens to her, it's what happens to us." Outside the lounge, a small media crowd had started to form near the terminal windows. Someone had posted a blurry video to social media. A still frame of Rachel standing over Elijah and Jasmine, one hand on her hip, mouth open in mid-command. The caption read, "Flight attendant demands black teens move from first class. Turns out they're the CEO's family." Plane grounded. And just like that, the internet had caught the scent. In homes, offices, dorm rooms, and cafes, the story began its slow climb through the algorithmic machinery of virality. Some watched in disbelief. Some reposted in solidarity. Some commented with outrage. A few tried to justify Rachel's actions. Maybe she was just following orders, or it's hard to tell who belongs where. But most saw it clearly. Two teens with valid seats had been treated like intruders, until power spoke up. And that, more than anything, was what struck a nerve. In the back seat of a black town car idling at the curb, Elijah and Jasmine sat side by side. The vehicle had been arranged to take them straight home, or wherever they needed to go. But for a long moment, they didn't speak. Jasmine clutched the gold box to her chest, her reflection flickering faintly in the tinted window. Elijah leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling, breathing slowly. Finally, she asked, "Do you think this is going to follow us?" He didn't answer immediately. She continued, her voice quieter. Like, are people going to say we ruined her life?" Elijah looked at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "No," he said. "They'll say we didn't let her ruin ours." At Airlink headquarters, a team of executives gathered inside a sleek, glass-walled boardroom. On the wall screen, the headline from a news site scrolled slowly, "Flight delayed after discrimination incident. Airline executive's family targeted by crew member." Below it, a video played in a loop, Rachel's voice raised, Elijah's calm reply, the shift in tone when the captain emerged. The communications director, a sharp-eyed woman named Laurel, looked up from her tablet. "We're getting calls from national outlets," she said. "CNN, NBC, even BBC. They want a statement, not just about Rachel, but about the airline itself." Nathaniel, still standing, folded his arms. "They'll get one." In a smaller meeting room just down the hall, the airline's HR compliance officer reviewed Rachel's personnel file. 12 years. Clean record, high efficiency ratings, good attendance. But the notes from this morning overrode it all. And the internal footage, the audio from the cockpit, the camera angles from the cabin, told the story too clearly. Rachel hadn't just made a bad call. She had made a pattern visible, a pattern that the airline had long pretended didn't exist. Until now. Back in the car, Jasmine finally loosened her grip on the box. She looked at Elijah. "You think she'll ever understand what she did?" He shrugged. "Maybe, but not today." "Do you think she hated us?" Elijah was silent for a long moment. Then, "No, I think she never saw us at all." Elsewhere, Rachel stepped out of the back entrance of the administration wing, now officially escorted by security. The duffel on her shoulder contained nothing more than her folded uniform, a pair of shoes, and a printed copy of her dismissal letter. Her name had already been removed from the crew roster. Her airline email now returned only, "This account no longer exists." As she approached the employee pickup zone, her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification she couldn't ignore. A friend had sent a link. The video. Rachel tapped it, watched herself raise her voice, watched Elijah refuse to move, watched the captain emerge, watched herself be dismissed. The video paused on her face, mid-sentence, mid-expression, mid-mistake. She didn't cry, but for the first time she flinched. In the corporate lounge, Nathaniel reviewed the final draft of the company's press statement. It read, "Airlink Airlines does not tolerate behavior that undermines the dignity of any individual. Our values are not conditional, they are policy. The crew member involved has been removed from duty following an internal review. We thank the passengers who maintained composure and integrity in the face of unacceptable conduct." He slid the paper aside, then stood. The media response had begun, but something deeper had begun too. A reckoning, not of Rachel, but of the system that let her believe she could act that way and never be questioned. Outside, as the town car pulled away from the terminal, Jasmine whispered one final question. "Will anyone learn anything from this?" Elijah's reply was soft, but certain. "Some will, some won't. But the ones who matter?" He looked out the window, then back at her. "They will." The story had spread faster than even Airlink's legal team could contain. By noon, the video clip, just 6 seconds long, had been viewed over 3 million times. News anchors debated it. Op-eds dissected it. Comment sections lit up with outrage, sympathy, and in some corners, disbelief. But no one disagreed on one thing. Something had happened on that plane that pulled back the curtain on more than one person. And it wasn't just about Rachel Stevens anymore. It was about the system that made someone like her feel so safe in being wrong. Inside a quiet corner cafe near the airport, Adele Watkins, 59, stirred her tea slowly. Her hands moved with care, gentle but deliberate, as if the motion helped her think. Her eyes stayed glued to the muted TV screen above the counter. She wasn't watching the anchor. She was watching the footage playing in the background, again. And this time, she saw what others didn't. The flight attendant in the video, sharp jaw, clipped voice, blonde bun pulled high, wasn't a stranger. Not to her, it was Rachel. And Adele had known her once. It had been 15 years. Back then, Adele was Rachel's trainer during her first year as a flight attendant. Rachel had been new, eager, meticulous, proud of her pressed uniform and her perfect posture. She had been smart, too. Rachel learned fast, followed protocols, and took notes without being told. But there was something else, something Adele had noticed even then, a certain hardness. Rachel treated rules like weapons, and people like variables. She smiled only when it served a purpose, and when challenged, even gently, she didn't bend. She bristled. Back then, Adele chalked it up to inexperience. She thought time would soften her, but it hadn't. It had just entrenched her. That afternoon, Adele sent an email to the airline's executive office with the subject line, "Regarding Rachel Stevens, former trainee." She didn't write much, but she asked to speak to someone in charge. And 2 hours later, she was sitting across from Laurel Chen, Airlink's communications director, in a private conference room downtown. "I don't want to defend her," Adele began, "but I also don't want her to be dismissed as some isolated error." Laurel folded her hands. "Go on." "She wasn't always cruel," Adele said, "but she was always rigid, and she never questioned her instincts, even when they conflicted with training." Laurel nodded slowly. "You think this was more than a single act?" "I know it was," Adele replied, "but I also know it didn't start with her. She didn't invent the silence that protected her for 12 years. Laurel's expression tightened. "That silence is exactly what we're trying to confront now." Adele leaned forward. "Then start with what you ignored back then." Elsewhere, in a dim hotel room just outside city limits, Rachel sat alone with a cheap sandwich and an untouched bottle of water. Her phone, after nearly a full day of silence, finally lit up. It was an unknown number, a short message. "I saw the footage. I remember who you were before. If you're ready to talk, I'm here. AW." She stared at the initials for a long time, and for the first time in hours she replied, "Where?" That evening they met at the same cafe Adele had been in earlier. Rachel entered cautiously, her hoodie pulled low, her eyes darting toward every face. She looked like someone expecting shame to wear a uniform too. Adele was already seated. She offered a nod. No hug, no judgment, just presence. Rachel sat slowly. She looked older than she had 24 hours earlier. They didn't speak for a full minute. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "I thought I was in control." Adele's voice was gentle. "Control built on fear isn't control. It's deflection." Rachel gave a dry laugh. "Sounds like something you said to me when I spilled coffee on a passenger my first week." "I did," Adele replied. "And you never forgot it." Rachel looked down. Her fingers traced the rim of her water glass. "I didn't even think," she said. "I just saw them, and I assumed." Adele's face didn't flinch. "What did you see, Rachel?" Rachel looked up, and for the first time, really looked ashamed. "I saw kids, black, young, in first class. I didn't think about names or titles, just that it didn't fit." "And why didn't it fit?" Rachel's lips parted, but no words came, because she finally understood what she'd been avoiding all along. It didn't fit because she didn't want it to. Meanwhile, in a quiet conference room at Airlink's PR office, Laurel met with Nathaniel Moore and the legal team. "Someone from HR unearthed Adele Watkins's name," she said. "She's coming forward voluntarily, wants to share her experience. She says Rachel's behavior is part of a wider pattern." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. Then we document it thoroughly. And if the press asks, we don't throw Rachel under the bus, Nathaniel said carefully, but we tell the truth. This wasn't about one woman. It was about an entire culture that let her thrive. Back in the car, Jasmine scrolled through her phone slowly. Her inbox had exploded. Classmates, friends, people she didn't know. Some offered praise, some apologized, some just said, "I saw you." But one message stood out. It was from a girl named Liana, someone Jasmine barely knew. "You don't know me, but I sat behind you on the plane. I didn't say anything. I should have. But I want you to know, your silence, it said everything. Thank you for not backing down." Jasmine blinked hard. She passed the phone to Elijah. He read it, then handed it back. "People saw," he said, "even when they didn't speak." That night, as Rachel walked alone back to her hotel, Adele's words followed her like footprints. "If you want to change, don't start with defending yourself. Start with listening to what your silence costs others." Rachel didn't sleep that night, but she started writing. Not a statement, not a defense. A letter. To Elijah and Jasmine. She didn't know if she'd ever send it, but for the first time she was trying, not to fix her image, but to face her reflection. The air in the press conference hall was still, heavy with anticipation, sharpened by silence. Rows of reporters filled the seats like a courtroom gallery. Photographers lined the back wall, lenses raised and waiting. Microphones stood clustered on a single podium, like anxious fingers, all pointed at a space not yet filled. The large projection screen behind the stage bore a single message in clean black serif. Airlink public statement. Live press event. Integrity, transparency, accountability. It was the kind of tagline corporate firms dust off when the consequences can no longer be hidden. But this time, it wasn't just a slogan. It was an apology in waiting. Across town, in a quieter, more secure room, Elijah and Jasmine Moore sat side by side at a long oak table. Their chairs were too big for their frames. The air conditioning hummed too loudly. And despite all the reassurances from lawyers and PR staff, the moment still felt like something neither of them had signed up for. A staffer offered them water, another brought them forms, and then finally Nathaniel Moore entered. "Everything's ready," he said calmly, placing a folder on the table. "You won't be speaking. You won't even be filmed. But your presence here? It changes everything." Jasmine looked up from the untouched bottle of water in front of her. "Will people care?" she asked. Nathaniel gave the faintest nod. "They already do." Back at the press event, Laurel Chen, communications director for Airline, stepped onto the stage. Her hair was tied neatly, her expression composed but grave. She stood behind the podium and exhaled once, silently. Then she began, "Good afternoon. My name is Laurel Chen. I represent Airlink's executive board and am authorized to deliver this message on behalf of the company's leadership team and ownership." She paused. The room remained silent, cameras blinking like nervous eyes. "In the past 72 hours, you've seen a video shared by millions, discussed on every platform, analyzed by voices from every perspective. What happened on Flight 227 from Houston was not a misunderstanding. It was not a gray area. It was not a moment of poor communication. It was a clear act of bias, executed by a senior staff member against two passengers who had done nothing wrong." Gasps weren't audible, but a shift was, a real one. The tone of the room tilted, no longer skeptical, no longer curious, just listening. In the private room, Elijah looked over at Jasmine, whose eyes were fixed straight ahead. He whispered, "You okay?" She gave a quiet nod, but her fingers still clenched the golden ribbon of the gift box in her lap. It was unopened, still perfect. The one thing that hadn't been tainted by the flight that changed everything. Back on stage, Laurel continued. "The crew member involved has been terminated. Her record has been submitted to the National Aviation Registry with a full behavioral annotation. She is no longer permitted to serve in any passenger-facing capacity within our network or our affiliates. But more importantly, we are no longer treating this as an isolated personnel issue." She leaned forward slightly. "This is a systemic reckoning." Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, Twitter feeds surged. For the first time in the airline's history, An executive admitted the system was broken and did so live. In a nearby viewing lounge, several passengers from the original flight had gathered by invitation. One of them, an older woman with silver-streaked hair, the one who had quietly spoken to Jasmine during the flight, held a tissue in her hand as she watched. "I never thought they'd say it," she murmured. A man beside her nodded. "I was there. I saw it. But I didn't speak, and they still did." Laurel closed the file before her. Then she continued, now off script. "I want to take a moment to speak directly to the passengers who were affected. Elijah, Jasmine, you did not ask for this. You did not provoke it. You did not escalate it. And yet, you carried the weight of that moment with more grace than most adults ever could. You showed the world what restraint looks like, and you reminded this industry, this country, that silence is not submission." She stopped. No tears. No emotion that would feel exploitative. Just conviction. Meanwhile, inside the admin building where Elijah and Jasmine sat, a staffer stepped in with an envelope. "From Ms. Stevens," she said. Nathaniel blinked. "Rachel," the staffer nodded. "She asked that this letter be delivered to the Moore family. No press." Jasmine took it. It was handwritten. 3 pages, folded once. She didn't open it yet. Neither of them did. Elsewhere, in a small town 20 miles outside Houston, Rachel Stevens sat in her childhood bedroom. The same room she once painted sky blue, back when she still believed the world was fair if you followed the rules. Her eyes were hollow. Her phone was turned off. She had declined interviews, turned down legal advisors, and refused all media contact. She didn't want to defend herself anymore. She wanted to understand how she got here. And that path, she now knew, didn't begin on that flight. It began years ago, the first time she saw someone different and assumed they were in the wrong place. She pulled out her notebook and began writing again. Not letters this time, a record of what she had done, of every moment she could remember that might have gone unnoticed, until this one didn't. In the press hall, Laurel was concluding, "We are initiating a full audit of crew behavior logs, passenger complaints, and discrimination reports over the past 10 years. Additionally, all flight attendants will now be required to undergo quarterly training, not just on policy, but on bias, on presence, on empathy. Because this wasn't about seats. It was about who we think belongs and why." In homes across the country, people watched from kitchen tables and office cubicles. Some nodded, some cried, some sat in uncomfortable silence, realizing that they too had once been Rachel, or had once said nothing, like the passengers around her, or had once been Elijah and Jasmine, and never gotten justice. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Houston skyline, Elijah and Jasmine stood alone on the rooftop patio of Nathaniel's office building. Below them, cars moved like slow fireflies. The city buzzed, but up here it was quiet. Jasmine finally unfolded the letter. She read it silently, then passed it to Elijah. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't an apology that fixed anything, but it was real. Rachel had written, "I saw you, but I didn't see you, and that difference is the one I'll live with for the rest of my life. I hope the world sees you now, as more than passengers, as proof that stillness can move mountains." Elijah folded the letter and tucked it in his jacket pocket. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Jasmine looked up. "Do you think we were supposed to be on that flight?" Elijah didn't answer right away, but when he did, it was quiet, unshaken. "No, but we were supposed to stay in those seats." The world didn't go quiet. It roared. By morning, the footage had surpassed 10 million views. News tickers spun across every major outlet. Talk shows dissected every detail. Social media ignited with hashtags. Here they belonged. Chonkyur first-class truth. Chonkyur airline accountability. But beyond the statistics, something more unsettling had begun. Airlink's inboxes overflowed. Not with hate mail, not just with praise, with stories. Passengers, crew, former employees. People who had stayed quiet for years, each with a tale of being made to feel lesser, unseen, unworthy. And suddenly, what had been a single incident was now a movement. In a high-rise office in Chicago, A senior vice president at another airline read the transcript of Airlink's press conference. She closed the laptop slowly, her coffee untouched. "We're next," she said to her assistant. "If they're finally being held to account, the silence everywhere else won't hold much longer." The assistant blinked. "Should we start auditing our logs?" She gave a tired smile. "No, we should have done that 5 years ago. Now we answer why we didn't." Meanwhile, in a modest apartment just outside Houston, Rachel Stevens sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the posts with bloodshot eyes. There was no shortage of commentary. Some posts called her the face of privilege. Some called her the fall of old policy. Some were cruel, mocking, and relentless. Others were more haunting, painfully honest. "I've met her type on too many flights." It wasn't just about race. It was the look, the tone, the assumption. She didn't see them. That's the problem. Rachel didn't respond. She didn't defend. She just read. And for the first time, she didn't look away. By noon, a new video surfaced. A former Airlink flight attendant, seated on her couch, speaking into her phone camera, said simply, "I was removed 3 years ago because I spoke up about a supervisor who treated certain passengers differently. I didn't name names then, but I will now. It was Rachel Stevens." The comment section flooded immediately. Rachel's name became a symbol, but no longer of excellence or discipline or leadership. Now it was a case study, an artifact of what happens when power isn't questioned until it collapses. At Airlink headquarters, the executive board convened again. Nathaniel Moore entered last. He didn't sit immediately. "There's more coming," he said. "We don't just have a PR crisis, we have a credibility crisis." Laurel, the communications director, nodded grimly. "And now we have former employees corroborating everything. Not just about Rachel, about a pattern." Nathaniel looked around the room. The faces were pale, tense. "Then we opened the vault," he said. "Every complaint buried, every incident silenced, every apology never sent. We own it, in public." A board member leaned forward. "Won't that destroy us?" Nathaniel didn't flinch. "Not doing it already did." Across town, Elijah and Jasmine sat in their living room, the afternoon light slicing through the blinds like quiet questions. The gift box still sat on the coffee table, unopened. Their grandmother's birthday had passed 2 days earlier. They hadn't made it. But the card inside the box, handwritten by Jasmine, read, "We can't wait to surprise you. You've always told us, don't let the world tell you where you don't belong." The irony was unbearable, but the truth of it had become undeniable. A knock came at the door. It was a woman from a national magazine, her tone respectful, her eyes cautious. "We're doing a feature," she said, "not just on the incident, on the two of you, your strength, your silence, what you represent." Elijah looked at Jasmine. She hesitated, then replied, "We didn't ask to represent anything." The woman nodded. "That's why it matters that you do." Back in her apartment, Rachel opened her laptop again. She wasn't reading the news, she was reading a letter. One she had written, one she hadn't sent. To a passenger she removed from a flight in 2016, a black woman. Middle seat, delayed boarding. No incident, just a random reassignment that Rachel had called policy. She had never thought about it again. Until now. She searched for the name. She found it. Dr. Evelyn Cooper, now a tenured professor of African American history. Rachel clicked on a recent photo of her, standing in front of a lecture hall, accomplished, poised, respected, and once dismissed because of Rachel. She clicked compose. She didn't write much, just, "You don't know me, but I remember what I did to you, and I've spent the last week realizing how much of that I've done without ever feeling the weight of it until now." She stared at the message, then pressed send. Back at the Airlink Media Center, Laurel reviewed incoming footage for a new video campaign. This one a response. Not a brand ad, a confession reel. Former staff, executives, passengers, each sharing one sentence. "I stayed silent when I dismissed it because I didn't believe her when." At the end, the screen would fade to black. Then white words would appear. "We're listening now, but that's not enough. We're changing because you demanded it." Later that evening, Rachel received a reply to her email. It was short. I remember. Thank you for the acknowledgement. It doesn't erase it, but it honors it. That's a start. Rachel leaned back in her chair, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fall, not as injustice, but as a consequence. That same night, Elijah and Jasmine finally opened the gold box. Inside was a small hand-carved wooden photo frame with a note tucked inside. This is for the next picture you take together, because one day you'll want to remember that you stood still when the world needed it most. They didn't cry, but they smiled, for the first time in days, because while the world still spun in noise, the truth they had lived remained still, unshaken, and now seen. The nation had moved on, at least on the surface. The hashtags had slowed. The media coverage shifted to the next scandal. New headlines replaced the old. And yet something lingered, quietly but firmly, like a watermark that couldn't be scrubbed from the memory of a country. Because what happened on Flight 227 hadn't just been about a seat, or a policy, or a single voice raised where it shouldn't have been. It had been about a truth, buried for too long, revealed in silence, and carried on the shoulders of two young passengers who didn't raise their voices, because they didn't need to. In a corner office at Airline headquarters, Nathaniel Moore sat reviewing the final internal report. It was thicker than anticipated, 218 pages, dozens of incidents, some dismissed, some mishandled, many never even filed. His jaw tightened as he turned the pages, reading the details that once never made it to his desk. Until now. Laurel Chen entered quietly, holding a digital tablet. Press has the final statement. We're greenlit to publish by morning, she said. He nodded. And the video? She gave a slow breath. Uploaded, no edits. Raw, as requested. Good. Then he leaned back and added, more to himself than to her. They didn't break us, Laurel. They reminded us we were already broken. Across town, in a much smaller space, Rachel Stevens sat on a park bench as wind tugged gently at the sleeves of her sweater. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't on the run. She was just still. For weeks now, she'd been volunteering at a local shelter. Not for redemption. Not because a court ordered her, but because, for once, she wanted to serve without controlling the rules. Every morning she swept the floors, folded towels, made coffee. She didn't wear a uniform anymore. And for the first time in years, she didn't miss it. A child from the shelter ran past her, laughing as he chased a paper airplane that had caught the breeze. She watched him, not with judgment, with wonder, because even paper with no engine could fly farther than she ever had with authority. In a university lecture hall in Atlanta, Dr. Evelyn Cooper paused mid-slide and turned to her class. I want to talk to you about stillness, she said. The class of 50 quieted. I want to talk to you about two teenagers who didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't plead. They just sat. And because of that, a billion-dollar company was forced to change. A hand went up. Are they coming here? She smiled. Next week. The room erupted. Because silence, when chosen wisely, always echoes louder than noise. Back in Houston, Elijah stood by the bookshelf in his room, staring at a framed photo recently delivered from the airline. It wasn't from Nathaniel. It wasn't from marketing. It was from Claire Nguyen, the young flight attendant who had been quiet, kind, and present that day. In it, she had written, "You didn't know it, but you taught me how to serve better, not with rules, but with awareness." On the shelf beside it was the wooden frame from their grandmother's gift. And inside, a photo of Elijah and Jasmine, side by side at the terminal, moments after stepping off the flight. Not smiling, not posing, just standing, together, present. At a quiet ceremony a week later, Airline unveiled a permanent plaque inside Terminal C of their flagship airport. Not near the gate, not behind glass, but by the seating area where the incident happened. It read, "Here, two passengers taught us a lesson we should have learned long ago. Dignity is not granted by uniform. It is not assigned by class. It is not checked at the gate. It is carried quietly, powerfully, and without apology." Jasmine stood in front of it now, her eyes fixed on the inscription. A reporter approached, camera rolling, mic already out. Jasmine, any final thoughts? Would you do anything differently? She didn't speak right away. Then she replied, with a calm as deep as the moment required. I wouldn't change a word we didn't say. The reporter blinked, because there was nothing more to ask. That evening, Elijah sat with Nathaniel on the rooftop terrace of the Moore family building. The city stretched before them, bathed in twilight. I think people expect us to become something now, Elijah said quietly. Advocates, speakers, symbols. Nathaniel nodded. And do you want that? Elijah thought for a long time. Then, I want the next kid who boards a flight alone, with a seat in first class, to not think twice about whether they are allowed to sit down. Nathaniel turned to him, pride and weight in his gaze. Then you've already become it. Back at the park, Rachel walked toward the shelter's side door, carrying a box of gently used coats for donation. A volunteer passing her paused. You're her, right? Rachel stopped. The woman's tone wasn't cruel, not accusatory, just aware. I am, she said. The woman nodded once, then held the door open. And for the first time, Rachel walked through a doorway she hadn't forced open, one that hadn't been labeled crew only. A door opened by presence, not by power. Weeks later, inside a quiet classroom where Elijah had returned to school, his teacher paused the lesson to ask. Elijah gave a small smile. It's when one small refusal tells a much bigger system, you don't get to do this anymore. That night, Jasmine wrote a post on social media. She rarely posted, but this one she knew needed to be said. We didn't want to be a story. We just wanted to visit our grandmother. We didn't want attention. We just wanted dignity. But if this story helped one person speak up, or stay seated, or believe they belonged, then maybe it was worth it. To the world, it wasn't bra. We weren't loud, but you heard us. That's all we ever wanted. The story of Elijah and Jasmine Moore is not just about a moment of discrimination. It is about how quiet courage can dismantle deeply rooted systems of assumption and bias. What happened aboard Flight 227 reminds us of a fundamental truth. Power does not equal integrity, and authority without empathy is fragile. It also reminds us that silence is not always weakness. When wielded with dignity, silence can become the most powerful voice in the room. Elijah and Jasmine didn't shout. They didn't protest. They didn't demand. They simply stayed seated, firm in the truth that they belonged exactly where they were. And that quiet refusal sent shockwaves through an industry, forcing an entire company to confront what it had allowed to go unchecked for far too long. The story teaches us, assumptions are not policy. No amount of training or uniform justifies treating someone as less than. Accountability matters, not only for the individual who acted wrongly, but for the system that protected them until they were caught. Change doesn't always come from noise. Sometimes it comes from presence, from stillness, from a refusal to be erased. Youth can lead without raising their voices, and when they do, they often teach the world what real leadership looks like. Perhaps the most profound lesson is this. You don't need to shout to be heard. You only need to stand or sit with unwavering truth. And in doing so, you remind the world, dignity is not optional. It is not assigned. It is a right, quiet, powerful, and unshakable.